In Pickman's Model by H.P. Lovecraft, Richard Upton Pickman is a painter who is excised from the art world within Boston high society after his grotesqueries are deemed so horrific that Bostonian critics cannot stand to even look at them. One of his friends, a fellow artist, is able to reconnect with Pickman and get a private showing of some of the paintings that were too grotesque to even be debuted before the disgusted critics, before getting to see Pickman's magnum opus, a human canine with red eyes chewing on its human quarry. Pickman leaves to shoot at what he tells the narrator later are some rats, while the narrator reaches for a photograph tucked in the painting that he believes will show the background of the subject that Pickman is painting, only for it to be revealed to him that the picture is not of the background, but the creature itself. Mark Powell is an Australian-born sculptor and painter who is known for his reclusiveness. In an article about his art in 2012 in Clutter, which now appears to mostly be a toy and art magazine, Powell has attributed the quote, "I've been working more or less in total isolation for several years, focusing primarily on sculpture. It's always possible with a horror artist like Powell that people are falsely attributing this quote to him because it builds a sense of mystique about his work, or as a result of his own good branding. However, there seems to be other accounts of people who have worked with Powell who basically claim to have been ghosted. In my effort to find the source for the original image for SCP-610, I turned up an account of a person who claimed to work with Powell while he was still working on tableaus, who responded to an account who claimed that Powell had disappeared because he made the decision to return to painting, asking the poster who had said Powell returned to painting if they had any way of getting in contact with him, and in the process discovered a mystery, which is Mark Powell still working? Hey, Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden here, and for this video I decided to do something a little different. Before I take a look at the actual SCP-610 story, I want to take a look at something that's probably even more interesting than the story itself, and that's the backstory behind the image, the mystery of what happened to the sculptor and artist Mark Powell. Before I do, if you're interested in readings and explication of short stories from someone with a background in both research and literature, I'd love for you to give the channel a follow. Each like, comment, and follow helps me build my golden order and brings me a little bit closer to doing this as a part-time and then hopefully later full-time job. The disappearance of Powell led me down a rabbit hole. The person who had claimed that Powell returned to painting is a user named Rokuro Karisu, who unfortunately has their comment history set to private, which should make it difficult to track if the person has any background in art broadly or miniature sculpting specifically. Essentially, when Reddit allowed users to begin to privatize their comment history, it makes it much more difficult for you to fact check that they are who they say they are, unless they're using that username on other websites. However, despite the fact that Karisu has their profile's comment history locked down, they happen to be one of those Reddit users who is using their username on other websites. Rakuro Karisu was active on several different websites under the exact same username. One area which they were incredibly active was with posting related to Champions Online, a now defunct superhero massively multiplayer RPG, which has you design your own superhero from the bottom up. I had played this one myself, and I felt like this MMO and also City of Heroes and City of Villains, which is like very similar. I think Champions Online even sprung up from COH and COV. They always felt like a really interesting place for artistic expression among amateurs, because unlike a lot of other MMOs, not only did you build your character completely, but if I'm remembering correctly, for both of these games, you were able to write a backstory for your character and feats for your character that then other players could see and interact with in an RP setting. This meant that these superhero MMOs from this era had a lot more opportunities for artistic expression than a lot of other MMOs, and a lot of people like Karisu were using this game as an outlet. Karisu has a large Flickr album of character designs within the game's engine that date back to 2012, the same time that Powell was quoted in Clutter magazine. Karisu also has a history of reviewing other people's miniature sculpts with comments on Warhammer 40k related sculpts, specifically Nurgle related sculpts, which are a huge crossover with kind of the horror community and Powell's work. They're kind of these demons of rot if you're unfamiliar with Warhammer. And that means that, you know, if you're interested in horror art, you're very likely to be interested in Nurgle sculpts specifically for the Chaos armies and Chaos demons of 40k. The last part of Karisu's relevant posting history requires me to take a quick detour in another part of creepypasta history. Another blogger and artist who was fairly active during this early wave of creepypasta-related works was Bogleach. I may do a larger profile on Bogleach at a later point in time, so I'm going to keep this review of their work to just one sentence. Bogleach was interested in these same kind of grotesqueries that I've already been talking about, but also has a history of doing these kinds of chibi grotesques that were really popular in the online horror world around this time. Karisu has a comment on Bogleach's blog where they are comparing some of the sculptures featured in a Halloween sculpture roundup to another type of figurine, this time custom sculpts from Warhammer Fantasy, which you can tell because of the square bases that Karisu links. I think from all of these comments that Karisu is likely someone who comments on art broadly and has a particular love for miniatures and horror art based on their comment history. It seems to me that it's fairly plausible that Karisu may have had brief contact with Powell and commented on his work at a time where it was shared publicly on a horror or painting website. But I don't believe there's any reason to assume that Karisu had any close contact with Powell like Powell's friend was hoping. It's also very possible that Karisu was confusing the British Mark Powell for the Australian one. And I'll get into the British Mark Powell a little bit later because it plays into a theory that I have. But now for Powell's friend, the user that asked Karisu if they had any information on how to contact Powell. This user is somebody with the screen name of Liam's Rob, who definitely appears to be Australian based on his posting history, which is primarily about Australian football and a few other Australian subreddits. This would make it plausible that this person did indeed know Powell at some point in time during his creative process. There aren't a lot of other hints about the identity or occupation of the Liam's Rob user, and the name appears to be a reference to an Australian cooking show called My Kitchen Rules. However, the user also claims to have traveled abroad to learn Arabic at the Hebron Excellence Center. If this user is a bit of a world traveler, despite world travelers being somewhat suspicious in my mind, this offers an explanation for how he fell out of contact with Powell in the first place. Liam's Rob gives us a possible unfortunate end to this part of our story, claiming in a comment from 2025 that he had recently had a conversation with someone who had informed him that Powell had unfortunately stopped producing art altogether. However, I'm unconvinced that this is necessarily true. Maybe it's just wishful thinking on my own part as someone who's always wanted to be a critic, but Powell has such a deep understanding of art and is following a clear artistic tradition of grotesquerie that I don't want to believe that someone who is that inspired to create would suddenly stop. In his dark art profile, he cites Geiger, Bakinski, whose name I know I'm pronouncing wrong, Belmer, Dali, Bosch, and Bruegel as inspirations, and I think the artistic traditions of these past greats are apparent in his art. I'm hopeful that he is simply ghosting Liam's for some reason unrelated to retreating from the art world and has decided to create pieces in a new medium under a new name. Powell would have a good reason to do that if he had gone back to painting especially, and Powell describes his own art as using miniature-based tableaus that are displayed on the ground to beckon the viewer into the dirt, a very different artistic sensibility than the portraiture painting that the British Mark Powell is engaging in. Before I get into the story itself, I actually think this is another good opportunity to talk about the problems with the Creative Commons license and the SCP Wiki. It seems very likely to me that ekphrastic stories, that is, stories that are based on art from another artist, that are not trying to brand that art itself under the Creative Commons license, would have been able to claim fair use. But because of the fact that everything written on the SCP Wiki, including the image itself, falls under the Creative Commons, it meant that the image had to be changed to a different image made by someone else on the wiki. Someone who took a lot of inspiration from Powell's work, but was still able to make something that looks distinct enough that it could be copyrighted under the Creative Commons. There seems to be some question online, based on a little bit of light Googling, about whether reproducing the art alongside the image that inspired an ekphrastic story would fall under fair use. However, in the case of Powell's artwork, unlike SCP-173, it seems that it likely would have. My reasoning for this is that the original SCP-610 author did not reproduce the entirety of the piece of artwork, and instead used a picture taken from a single part of Powell's dream diorama tableau. One of the key tests for an ekphrastic story being able to reproduce the image that inspired it is if the image is only part of a larger artwork, and that is 100% what happened in the case of SCP-610. So once again, SCP-610 is another case of the Creative Commons license working against the artists who seem intent on using it. One quick note, and maybe another word of caution for people who lend their artistic crafts to the SCP Wiki, But in the end, it actually became harder for me to track down the source of the new image used for SCP-610. And while Powell is credited all over the place, I'm not seeing any credits for the creator of the new diorama that the wiki used as a replacement image for the article. If you do a Google search, you'll get some AI gibberish which talks about an image of a 3D modeler's dog that if you attempt to verify it leads only to a picture of their dog. Surprise, surprise, and nothing else. You would think that any website that was at least halfway decent at its own archival work would have documented the replacement images and the date of its replacement within the discussion forums that are found in each article. And while they did document when they took down the picture after not hearing from Powell to enter a licensing agreement to release the image to the wiki, this was on April 22nd of 2020, there is no staff post explaining that a new image has been made by a fan and released to the wiki for its use on the SCP-610 article. As someone who decided to start talking about internet horror because it's related to my two interests of cultural archival of the internet and horror, I really find the lack of communication from staff on the wiki to be frustrating, but not surprising. As I said in my previous video about copyright and the SCP Wiki, without any kind of communal copyright that would allow for actual profit to be made in growing the wiki, as I said in my previous video about copyright and the SCP Wiki, without any kind of communal copyright that would allow for actual profit to be made in growing the wiki, there isn't a real incentive to keep the wiki well run. I would even argue that in lieu of any kind of profitability, it allowed for the toxic culture of power users trying to arrange hookups with fans, which even led to some grooming allegations towards certain members, because there's no professionalism for work that isn't a professional endeavor. This is, of course, about specifically Dr. Bright, but there have been allegations towards other people on the wiki as well. I have some thoughts on the story itself and why the SCP Wiki was able to become such a cultural mainstay in its early years, but I think those are best saved for the story itself. So without further ado, I present you all with the Flesh That Hates. SCP Item Number SCP-610, Object Class Keter. Special Containment Procedures. Due to the vast area of infection SCP-610 covers, containment is impossible. Isolation of the area has proved far more effective, and permission has been granted by the Russian government to establish a perimeter to keep people out of these areas under the guise of military operations. Should any organism displaying traits consistent with SCP-610 be sighted near this perimeter, then the established protocol requires it be engaged at range with small arms until immobile, then dispatched using incendiary weapons and munitions from as great a distance as possible. Any living thing coming in physical contact with an organism infected with SCP-610 is considered expendable, and it is immediately terminated and incinerated. Any persons coming within 3 meters of SCP-610 infected life are to immediately withdraw from the area, be isolated from the rest of their team, and subjected to medical examination using only remote techniques to determine if infection has occurred, and appropriate steps taken based on that determination. At present, the known infection vectors for SCP-610's spread seem to be focused on physical contact. Drone movements within heavily infected areas have returned air samples containing minute particulate, which when exposed to organic compounds will result in the spread of SCP-610. The results of these particular tests have revealed that most require several days to manifest, if at all, with the exception of direct contact with exposed lung and liver tissue. These particular tests show a rapid rate of growth which requires incineration of the testing environment no more than 24 hours after initial exposure, with even a 2-hour mishap risking a compromised facility event. Given that this kind of rapid growth only occurs in organic material existing outside the human body, this form of infection is currently considered a minor concern. These peculiarities have given rise to a series of questions regarding the possible origin of the infection in conjunction with the failed data expunged. Containment protocol remains at a scorched earth policy at this time, and no concern for transmission via water or air at infection parameters exists, barring situational changes in the field. Description. Initial reports of SCP-610 came direct from the Russian government through undisclosed channels. These reports consisted primarily of disappearances of farmers in the region and were not considered until the local police, followed by the regional police, and finally a government-dispatched agent all failed to report within a 72-hour period. A small military contingent was dispatched to the area and quickly withdrew, at which point the Foundation was contacted to investigate. The area SCP-610 affects is close to Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. Areas of known infection are marked on a map provided to us here. Containment perimeters are marked in blue surrounding these infection areas, and as present, no further locations have been identified. Incursions into the perimeter must be reported prior to conducting, confirmed during exploration, and debriefed on immediately following return. SCP-610 appears to be a contagious skin disease, at first with symptoms including rash, itching, and increased skin sensitivity. Within 3 hours, the disease will cause blemishes resembling heavy scar tissue to form in the chest and arm areas, spreading to the legs and back within an additional hour, consuming the victim completely within 5 hours. Exposure to higher temperatures vastly decreases the time for the contagion to spread, and complete infections have been recorded occurring in as little as 5 minutes. After the completion of the infection occurs, the victim's life functions will cease for approximately 3 minutes, after which time they will restart 2 to 3 times the activity rate of a normal human. Following this, the scar tissue on the victims will start to move of its own accord and grow at a rapid rate. Normal human features start to disappear at this point under the infection, and a path of mutation appears to be largely random. Subjects observed in this stage of infection have been recorded as growing 3 or more limbs of a type such as arms or legs. The head may become misshapen and elongate or widen out, and parts of the subject may split open, from which additional branches of flesh will grow. The duration of this stage of infection is unknown, and not all subjects appear to progress at later stages. Under unknown conditions, an infected individual will cease moving and place itself in a location it deems suitable where it roots itself. The fleshy growth on the victim will then begin to spread itself across all surrounding objects and consume them. Such objects do not spread the infection as living creatures do, however, and the effect of prolonged contact with these objects is recorded later in this document. It is assumed that this behavior is to create an area hospitable to continued growth of the other infected. Observation of life infected by SCP-610 by staff is impossible. Those infected with the disease immediately seek out aid as natural human impulse, resulting in unintended infections. Those infected past the scar tissue phase actively and aggressively attempt to infect anyone approaching them within an undefined area. It has been established that should an infected be capable of sight and observe an uninfected, it will proceed toward them. If the infected has lost the ability of sight, a range of approximately 30 meters is considered safe. Observation of 610 infected settlements has been established using artificial methods such as remote robots. The data returned from these observations, coupled with the openly aggressive nature of the infected to attempt to spread SCP-610, has resulted in the Keter classification. However, so long as nothing is allowed to enter or leave the infected areas, it is considered a neutralized threat. Of concern are the cavernous areas beneath the infected settlements that were discovered during the exploration, and attempt to get research personnel into these areas are underway. There are a few reasons that the SCP universe caught on via its wiki. I think one of the biggest reasons is all of these ekphrastic stories. Ekphrastic stories were really popular in the early days of creepypasta. Jeff the Killer is like a super famous example, but all of the stuff surrounding Slender Man as well is also based off of a single image Photoshop contest. So some of the most popular creepypasta figures are based on ekphrastic stories. And there could be a few different reasons for that. One of the reasons for that popularity of ekphrastic stories that I've been batting around in my head is the idea that a lot of people were graduating on from having read scary stories to tell in the dark at a younger age. All of those stories had an image that was associated with them, so it does seem like a pretty good guess, but there could be other reasons as well. I don't think it's just the ekphrastic nature of the SCP Wiki that caused these stories to catch on, though. Some of these stories didn't even have images attached with them at first. But I think that the other reason that these stories might have caught on is that some of these stories were essentially serving as a repository for the author's tabletop RPG hooks. There's a tabletop RPG called Delta Green that I believe many of the SCP Wiki's entries that heavily utilize field logs for mobile task forces take inspiration from. And why shouldn't they take inspiration from the RPGs that they were writing? I've already noted that there was quite a lot of crossover between the people who were writing SCP Wiki entries and who were active on other boards on 4chan, and some of the more well-adjusted authors would have been using boards like TG in addition to X rather than boards like B. TG was the board for traditional gaming, so there's good reason to believe that some wiki authors were inspired by their time with tabletop games to write entries on the wiki. Keep in mind, too, that the person who claims to have commented on Powell's work was also commenting on traditional gaming miniatures in a lot of forums. So, again, I think a good reason to suspect that potential crossover. This is definitely no exception to that idea because the author omitted the final field log that was planned because it was originally intended to be based off of an actual online RPG that he was going to be DMing. Overall, I think this works both for and against the SCP Wiki. It feels like the idea of being able to play the scenarios in some of these entries out as a game was instrumental to the SCP Wiki developing a devoted fandom. God knows that far more people are in love with D&D than have active playgroups. However, if we take a look at something that came out after the Wiki, which is the invention of the lit RPG, people transcribing their game notes and game ideas to create literature, most of them have a quality of writing that leaves quite a bit to be desired. So to be totally clear, what we're getting here is essentially the central plot hooks for a Delta Green game that has a unique take on what a zombie is, thanks to the inspiration from Mark Powell's art. Does it work better than fantasy lit RPGs that I've derided so far? Well, let's take a look at the field logs and find out. Field log 1. After establishing the containment perimeter for SCP-610, the Russian government approved our request to research and investigate the area. For the first such exploration, a small camera-mounted unit known as Herbie was dispatched at a safe distance and directed towards Site A. Herbie has a battery life of 12 hours and a control range far wider than that required for this dispatch. Herbie is able to enter Site A without incident. The landscape around Site A shows early stages of assimilation by singular SCP-610 infected who have fallen at largely random intervals around what remains of the village. Many of the homes appear to have suffered fire damage long since put out. However, a fair amount remain intact. Aerial reconnaissance of Site A combined with thermal imaging has put it at an estimated population of 79 infected. Mobile infected are included in this number. However, it is difficult to ascertain an exact percentage of mobile versus immobile. Varying degrees of physical mutation due to SCP-610 are present in Site A, and it is assumed that all the inhabitants are in advanced stages of infection. Herbie observed the exterior of the village for 2 hours, during which time all infected behaved with what appeared to be a loose sense of social structure. Because Herbie remained stationary during the observation period, it is unknown precisely what each individual infected person was doing. However, the central plaza experienced occasional bursts of activity and downtime. Requiring more information, Herbie was directed to follow an infected as it entered a home. There is a bumpy camera feed as Herbie scoots over the gravel behind the quickly shambling infected person. The interior of this home is the same as that attached to the primary file for SCP-610. So let's talk about the primary piece of art for SCP-610, or the original intended primary piece. In Mark Powell's art, you can see basically what looks to be a humanoid figure sitting at a table, and they have face tendrils that are coming out to eat a meal. There's also a person that is wrapped in barbed wire behind them to the left from the viewer's perspective, and also somebody that appears to be at some kind of cage or loom or something along those lines, another humanoid figure more or less directly behind them. There's also a giant bug, like a bug the size of a small dog, on a nightstand, and a person in a bed who gets beaten by this subject of the main painting. There also appears to be another giant bug of some kind under the table, but you can't really make out what exactly is down there. You can just kind of see its outline and some of its feet. It's a very effective piece of art at evoking a lot of negative feelings of dread and unease. The giant bugs especially, I think, add to the idea that things are being mutated. In Powell's original explanation of the piece, though, they're being mutated by dreams, not by any kind of infection. The infected being tailed is the one sitting at the table, the subject of the art. After entering the home, Herbie's camera was raised slowly as to not draw attention. The action was either unnoticed or ignored. The infected person is watched from the doorway as it hobbles around the home and stops at each of the other visible infected organisms. However, it appears to ignore the one under the table, which, while not immobile, does not leave that area. What this creature was before infection is unclear. After lapping the table and repeating this procedure 3 times, the primary infected person, known as Alpha henceforward, stops the bedridden infected, known as Beta, and proceeds to assault it with furious punches. Beta is unable to leave the bed for unknown reasons, but is not completely immobile, as it flails its arm in response to the beatings delivered by Alpha. After several sustained minutes of this beating, a piercing sound explodes from the area around Beta, and then proceeds to project a cloud of unknown matter into the air from its chest cavity. Alpha lingers in the cloud as it floats in the air around them, slowly descending to the ground. Unknown life form on the table, aside Beta, begins to twitch in an apparent seizure, and Alpha then laps the room twice more, stopping again at each infected organism, but still ignoring the one under the table, as well as Beta now. After these 2 laps, Alpha seats itself at the table and reaches out to position the 3 plates atop as if it is setting a dinner set. After the plates are positioned, the facial tendrils extending from Alpha wiggle up and start to coil on one of the plates before tearing apart and separating. This is repeated at each plate. The image attached to SCP-610's primary file is a still image of this occurrence. After each plate is filled with Alpha's flesh, it leaves the table and approaches Herbie, which is moved from Alpha's path. Alpha leaves the home, but Herbie's camera remains focused on the table. After several minutes, a group comprised of 6 to 7 infected enter the room from outside, still ignoring Herbie. Each infected shambles as if movement is difficult, jerking in large steps or squirming in small ones. These infected all surround the table, and each take turns grabbing handfuls of the flesh substance left behind by Alpha, pressing it into whatever orifices on themselves that they can, some into mouths, some into the chest, some behind their backs, and some under the arms. When all the plates are empty, the group leaves. Herbie remains here for several more minutes before retracting its camera and leaving. Immediately after leaving the home, Herbie collides with an object. Panning the camera around the obstruction appears to be Alpha, whose facial tendrils are intermingling with another infected having similar mutations. The impact is ignored, and the 2 infected part ways after several minutes. Herbie is then directed to explore more areas of the village. The remains of what appears to have been a store show signs of severe fire damage, as well as activity inside the building, which Herbie moves to investigate. The door is slightly ajar, and with firm movements of Herbie, it is pushed open. No notice is taken of this action, or it is ignored. Inside the store are several infected persons, most of whom are standing around. However, one is on the ground rolling back and forth over the space of approximately 0.3 meters and is ignored by the others. Herbie rolls under the divider, separating the cashier area from the customer area, and pans around behind the counter. The upper half of a person is protruding from a cellar door behind the counter. This person does not appear to be suffering from advanced infection and wears the garb of a Russian soldier. Herbie zooms the camera in to confirm identification, and it is noticed the eyes of this person are in constant movement, often focusing on Herbie. The rest of the soldier does not move. Herbie is directed to leave the area and proceeds to the back room. In this storage area, a large pile of bodies are stacked together. Some pieces of clothing are visible and appear to contain both military garb and everyday clothing. No facial features are discernible on any of the bodies due to the way they are stacked. Atop the bodies, an infected sits, appearing to have the lower parts fused to the pile, and with its upper half in a wild state of flailing and seizure. Approximately every 10 seconds, a burst of spores flies out of the top of this infected, which linger in the air. Herbie is directed to leave the building. After leaving this building, Herbie passes by the village well, surrounding which are a series of immobile infected all facing the well. The arms of each of these infected persons are stretched out, one in contact with the next, forming a perfect chain, save for one whose arms are down at its sides. Herbie passes by this last infected to approach what appears to have been the town hall or mayor's building when the infected becomes mobile and snatches the rover up. Video feed from Herbie focuses on the face of the infected, which is strangely in perfect shape given the condition of the rest of its body, which is horribly bloated. The infected was once a young girl from appearance, age estimated 10 to 12. Herbie is rolled side to side in its grip as its face stares motionless at the rover. The infected's face suddenly balloons in size and explodes outward into a series of fleshy flaps that grip Herbie and draw it inside. Herbie's video feed terminates here. Herbie was considered lost at this point. However, no one at control remembered to turn off the video feed, assuming it cut. 5 hours later, Herbie's video feed resumed, stationary and at a raised level pointing at the upper rim of the village well. The video feed contains some blur due to what appears to be a slimy film which often oozes across the lens, but when not obscured provides perfect quality recording. Herbie does not respond to any remote commands, but its video jerks back and forth from target to target, zooming in and out of its own accord. Video feed is cut manually and all connections to Herbie's unit are ordered erased. At the end of the first field log, there are some pretty interesting leads for players to look into if we continue to look at this through the lens of it being an RPG hook. These zombies are a more Cronenbergian nightmare than anything out of Night of the Living Dead, but they seem to have some memory of their time as humans, even acting out things that could be interpreted as domestic violence or a potential affair or something similar when the 2 infected have their facial tendrils intermingle after Alpha slips away from what you could presume is its family. It also appears to us as readers that there are certain infected that are being preserved in their human appearance for whatever reason, God knows what, such as the Russian soldier or the little girl at the well. And lastly, the infection even appears to be able to incorporate an inorganic drone into whatever kind of hive mind this infection is. I know that the connections to Sarkicism were not as well established at the time because the greater lore of the SCP Wiki was still being built back when they would allow these ekphrastic stories that used images from established artists. But it's obvious that most of this is going to be the backdrop of the SCP Wiki's XB ideology of neo-Gnosticism. Neo-Gnosticism is often used as an evil religion in horror stories for a few reasons, not in the least of which is because Gnostics within the Knights Templar claim to have John the Baptist's head and that it would speak to them, which is basis enough for any kind of horror genre fiction already. However, Gnosticism also somewhat purports to be a religion of the flesh, as in one that elevates humanity over concerns of spirituality. Though given the somewhat spooky origins of the religion, the flesh aspect often gets interpreted literally. This literal interpretation of a religion based on flesh is also used in the Magnus Archives, which has a ritual toward the dread horror of the flesh happening at a Gnostic temple and involving humans who have lost control of their faculties, feeding tons of meat to a giant pit with some beast's mouth in it. All in all, this is a pretty common framing for modern Gnosticism, and the fact that the Blavatsky and esoteric far-right religious believers have also used Gnostic ideas to push their personal belief that there have been other ages other than the age of man and other gods than the Abrahamic God has not done any favors for the PR of Gnosticism in the modern age. I talked about Blavatsky a little bit on my video on Ted the Caver, but if you need a refresher or you haven't seen that one, Blavatsky's take on religion served as an inspiration for some writers in pulp like Clark Ashton Smith, and then would later become associated with the far right because of H.P. Lovecraft's personal beliefs, especially if we're talking about in the post-war period where people were rediscovering Lovecraft's work. That's not Blavatsky's only connection to the far right, but it is probably the most literary one. All right, on to Field Log 2. During construction of the perimeter surrounding SCP-610's containment area, several D-Class personnel were infected due to assaults from infected villagers or animals roaming the area, in addition to a number of infections as a result of escape attempts and careless behavior. Most of these infected personnel were immediately destroyed with flamethrowers. However, a small collection of infected were contained in cold storage units, which prolonged the inevitable progression of SCP-610's mutative properties. The decision was made to utilize some of these infected personnel as video relays and dispatch them into nearby sites. Due to the concern over loss of equipment as evidenced in SCP-610-L1, Log 1, all 3 subjects that were used in this manner were sent with a single video system to Site C. Additional equipment issued for this dispatch include a 1-gallon container of gasoline, 3 emergency flares, 3 9mm pistols with 3 magazines of ammo each, 3 single-serving food rations. The infected personnel were instructed to observe and avoid interaction with the infected villagers as long as possible, but should a situation arise where they are met with aggression or feel they are losing themselves to SCP-610's influence, they are free to kill as many infected villagers as they so choose and do as much damage to infected objects and property as possible while maintaining video feed. The intent of this order was to provide data of SCP-610 infected communities in a raid situation, so a plan of eradication could be better established. At the time of this expedition, Site C was suspected to be a possible origin point for SCP-610, having far fewer mobile infected than other sites, as well as structures which appear to have layered over several times with the terramorphing effects of the immobile infected. Dispatching Class D personnel, known henceforth as DI-1, DI-2, and DI-3, were dispatched to pay particular attention to anything that could be considered an origin point for SCP-610. The trek from our perimeter camp to Site C was uneventful. There is no evidence of any native animal life in the area. As Site C is approached, there is a noticeable rise in the temperature within the last 30 meters of the trip that necessitates removal of the heavy cold-based coverings that were provided. The temperature rises again sharply at the entrance to Site C, which requires a further shedding of garments for fear of heat stroke. Site C is described as being heavily humid and around 32 degrees Celsius. 89 degrees Fahrenheit for my American listeners. One of the first immediately noticed traits about Site C is an array of immobile pylons, which encircle what is believed to be the entirety of the site. Separated by an apparent distance of 5 to 6 meters, each pylon appears to be 2 to 4 infected persons fused together in one spot. On some of these pylons, features such as faces or anuses are still visible in addition to several other holes which do not naturally occur, all appearing to act as heat vents. Where the heat is generated is unknown. Current belief is that this is an advanced stage of SCP-610 terraforming its environment to facilitate spread of itself. DI-2, which was furthest along in progression of SCP-610 of the three by number of hours, begins to seize after only a few minutes in Site C during examination of the pylons. The progression to the scar tissue phase of SCP-610 infection is observed in full course as DI-2 spasms to the ground, his entire body being overtaken by the sickly tan flesh almost entirely after 45 seconds. DI-2 is terminated by a gunshot from DI-1 and his equipment left where it is. The spread of SCP-610 over DI-2 continues even after death of the body until all movement ceases. As Perimeter Control is relaying new instructions to DI-1 and DI-3 regarding the situation, there's a shift in the ground covering the Site C where DI-2's body is. Video feed shows the flesh-like growth splitting open beneath the body and a series of ropey tendrils coming from the gap to pull his corpse inside. The opening quickly closes, total time elapsed 3 seconds. As DI-1 and DI-3 decide to act quickly in these hotter temperatures, fearing the same fate, they proceed to the village center and encounter another previously unknown phenomenon. In the precise center of town, rising above what was the community well, is a sphere suspended by angled supports composed of SCP-610 flesh. This ball is riddled with the features of humans in early stages of SCP-610 infection, as well as a good number assumed to be in later stages. A number of specimens of non-human life forms, such as deer and bear, are also visible within the mass. The entire sphere of flesh pulses at roughly a 5-second interval, and with each pulse emits a ring of spore-like material from its equator. This material floats to the ground and appears to be absorbed into the converted environment. DI-3 begins to douse the sphere with the provided gasoline, and when questioned by a panicking DI-1, explains that this looks like as good a thing to burn as any. At this point, Perimeter Control has ceased giving commands due to the rapid deterioration of events. There is no reaction from anything within Site C to any of this activity until the precise moment at which a lit emergency flare is applied to the spherical mass, which immediately goes up in flames. The remote feed plays back a noise from an unknown location that seems to come from a location far outside of Site C, but was reported as being heard even at Perimeter Control by both Sites C and A. The noise is described as both explosive, as if multiple high-yield charges were detonated on a mountainside, and alive, like a large feral creature roaring. Within 15 seconds following the sound's dissipation, Site A reported that a series of explosions has occurred within the village. 5 seconds after this report, the spherical mass in the middle of Site C explodes. DI-1 and DI-3 are thrown by the blast. DI-3 is confirmed deceased by DI-1 after regaining his footing, having suffered injury from stone shrapnel from the well. DI-1 is able to report he has bruises and ringing ears, but aside from the rapidly spreading SCP-610 infection, he suffered no blast damage. During this recording of footage, DI-1 had his video equipment removed and was looking into it. Due to this angle of recording, it is unknown precisely what occurred in Site C, but something draws DI-1's attention back to the center of town, where he stares for several moments, then is pulled in the opposite direction. The video equipment fall into the ground and recording in a skyward direction. The last moments of footage from DI-1's video unit display a humanoid figure moving through the air, followed by the sound of an impact in the same direction. Within 3 seconds of this event, an unknown creature steps upon the recording equipment and destroys it. Perimeter Control remained on high alert for a full 24 hours at all locations without any incident following the event. Log 2 has an increased prevalence of some of the RPG qualities that can make lit RPGs unbearable, such as the enumeration of what supplies the infected D-Class are going to be given to explore the quarantined area. I do think there are some elements of strong early writing in the SCP Wiki here. I especially like the description of the noise that's overheard in Site C when the D-Class blow up the flesh sphere in the town. The description of the area beginning to be terraformed into an environment where everything is partially flesh is also a great choice creatively. I do think there's a bit of an RPG style, we must blow up the MacGuffin key plot element, in this case the orb. But that said, at the very least, you can't say that SCP-610 is carrying on some of the chief problems of SCP-093 that I've already read on this channel, the Red Sea object. One of the ways that the Red Sea object keeps the mystery alive for the reader is by having the extraction teams recover documents that we as an audience don't get to read until the final addendum, which is a document log. Even within the format of the SCP Wiki, this felt a bit like cheating and cheapened the suspense that the story was going for by keeping those documents secret from the reader. Unfortunately, though, I also feel like at this point we're starting to get the build-up to a boss monster for people to take on during the RPG, the proverbial dragon of this dungeon. And, you know, it's not bad writing per se, but the idea that the story even needs that necessarily is a symptom of it being written as an RPG hook and not as a piece of literature first and foremost. And there are some other things that begin to become a problem too. The lack of characterization of any of the characters. Again, this is being written as an RPG hook. The characters are the players, and they haven't shown up yet, so we don't need to characterize any of these NPCs. I don't necessarily agree with that line of thinking, even in writing an RPG hook, and I'll get into that on my total thoughts on the story, but the lack of characterization is really noticeable here compared to SCP-093. We're kind of getting to a point where if we had the strengths from this story plus the strengths from SCP-093, because they have different strengths, we'd have a good piece of writing on the wiki. And that does start to happen, but it doesn't happen in these very early days of writing on the wiki. So, on to Field Log 3. The destruction caused by the rapid collapse of the Site C exploration attempt during SCP-610-L2 resulted in a series of unexpected events in Site A. As the strange spherical formation in Site C was burned and destroyed, the SCP-610 infected inhabiting Site A were recorded by aerial drones going into seizures and convulsions. The immobile SCP-610 infected rapidly shriveled and died along with all the flesh material spread across inanimate objects within the village. The mobile SCP-610 infected who were able to regain their footing all proceeded to what appears to have formerly been an upper-class residence and entered the building. As the infected entered the dwelling, it suffered a foundational collapse, revealing the presence of a sinkhole beneath it. The size of the sinkhole in relation to the structure above it posed an impossibility for an entire building to collapse, suggesting something within the hole applied force directly to the structure with the intent to pull it inside the exposed hole. The revealed hole is approximately large enough to accommodate 3 grown men standing shoulder to shoulder. Light sources applied by remote drones fail to penetrate further than 4-meter depth into the hole. Objects dropped into the hole do not produce an impact sound, suggesting a bottom potentially more than 1,000 meters down. Research of the exterior of the Site A hole was only able to be carried out for 2 hours' time. Samples of the atmosphere in Site A indicate a complete death of SCP-610 related materials. All infectious life that did not evacuate into the hole died above ground and quickly became shriveled husks. Manned exploration of Site A was approved and commenced immediately in the span of 30 minutes. A total of 3 research teams consisting of 2 to 3 research staff and 4 to 5 armed escort were each dispatched and setting up stations within the remains of the village. Samples of deceased SCP-610 infected and converted matter were sent back to Perimeter HQ for processing and transport. One team was able to recover a small sample of still-living SCP-610 tissue substance from a building and pack it for research. Within the second hour of exploration of Site A, a series of echo reverberation units were set up surrounding the hole with the intent of getting an accurate mapping of the hole and possible branch tunnels. I remember around the same time of this specific entry coming out on the wiki, 2009, there were a lot of circulation of kind of, I would say more of an online urban legend than a creepypasta, but the idea that the Russians were trying to dig a hole to hell and they had recorded something that made them stop digging, it was like an urban legend that was spread around in the 2000s a lot. I do think that this specific log and the idea of something being deep beneath the ground here, especially since the story takes place in Russia, may be taking some inspiration from that urban legend. Again, very common for people that are writing these RPG hooks to do something like that. At the end of the second hour, before the echo units could be activated, seismic activity began to occur within Site A. 2 teams of the original 3 remained on site. The third en route back to Perimeter HQ with samples. The third team was instructed to proceed back to Perimeter HQ when seismic activity began and was told that Site A should not be returned to for assistance. Seismic activity at Site A capped at 2.3 Richter level before petering off. Immediately following the seismic event, a torrent of SCP-610 spores erupted from the hole and layered the areas around it for a span of 50 meters. As all the staff on Site A were in Level A hazardous materials suits, the spore burst was startling but did not lead to any infections. As the eruption was being reported, both teams at Site A came under attack from aerial life forms infected with SCP-610. These organisms were captured by the remote drone video equipment and showed extremely advanced stages of infection. It is impossible to tell what they mutated to from this present state. Many of the avian creatures attacked by splitting their heads in half and clamping them against research members, pulling them into the air and dropping them into the hole when possible. These avian infected proved vulnerable to small arms fire. In dispatching them, a total of 2 research staff were lost to the hole and 1 injured due to crossfire. The injured staff was put down immediately upon showing signs of infection due to his suit breach. Before video and radio contact was lost with the remaining teams inside Site A, a second seismic event began to occur, starting out in the 1 to 1.5 range and scale. Attention was directed at the hole to prepare for a second assault. A second spur burst erupted from the hole during this rising seismic activity. At the point where scales registered to a 3 to 3.5 in force, a new unseen SCP-610 entity began to emerge from the hole. The only footage captured of this creature depicts an engorged human head approximately 20 times larger than normal, pressing itself out of the hole with no discernible body. Video and radio contact were lost as seismic forces increased to 7 on the scale for 2 seconds duration, then abruptly ceased. Further aerial surveillance of the Site A hole, an area depicts 0 activity and no traces of the research teams or their ever having been there. All personnel and equipment are considered lost. So here we have our big hook for the RPG setting in mind. Log 3 gives us more of what I was saying was explicit in the Magnus Archives as well in their interpretation of Gnosticism. There's a giant creature underground that could either be the source of these infections in the first place or the result of all these infections getting the opportunity to accumulate into something with a significant amount of biomass. Either way, what we're getting here is the introduction of the big bad that could serve as the end cap to a campaign that takes place in this infection zone of SCP-610. While I mentioned before that I think in this specific SCP, this is a fairer way to do the addendums than SCP-093, I do think there's a legitimate question to be raised about what, if anything, is being raised in these logs that actually has value to the story. It's interesting that this take on zombies can do something different from many of the other depictions of zombies, and zombies as a kind of Cronenbergian hive mind that only cares about extending its reach is an interesting approach to a zombie story that would have been a bit of a breath of fresh air in an oversaturated zombie genre at the time of this SCP's release. But being 3 entries in without working toward anything thematically and any characterization, you do begin to wonder if there's going to be any weight to the story by the time we get to the end of the story. And surprise, surprise, there's really not. A lot of the more modern SCPs that are trying to do a similar story would have had characterization on the scientists that were on the research team. This would be a good log to be much longer and essentially serve as the short story component to this SCP entry, but we don't really ever get that at any point. And it becomes clear that the intent was for the log with the players that are playing the RPG to become the part of the story with that characterization. Unfortunately, though, it never got written. I hope that the RPG at least got to happen, but there's no evidence that it did from the short story itself. On to field log 4. Events regarding the discovery, research, and handling of SCP-610 rapidly degraded to a point where fail-safe options were being considered. For over 1 hour, nothing further had happened at Site A following the loss of the research teams during the seismic events in SCP-610-L3, and subsequent contact with previously unseen SCP-610 lifeforms. With the absence of activity at Site A, a remote drone dispatch was authorized in 2 parts. The first would be to drop a remote relay device at the entrance of the Site A sinkhole, and the second part would be to dispatch a drone into the hole directly to relay its data to the remote relay for transmission back to HQ. Drones on site were powered by solar energy with a battery maintaining a 4-hour charge. Attached is the video log recovered from the Site A sinkhole drone before its loss. Video feed activates. Researcher's face is seen looking into the camera. A applying a polishing cloth to lens. This is Explorative Drone RSCP-610-1. Coming online. Systems check out. Video confirmed. Feed is good to relay station. We are testing rotors now and deploying if successful. Video feed is go, engines are go, links are green. Alright, sending drone down now. Audio from the outside world fades away as camera angles itself down and peers into the darkness within the sinkhole. After approximately 2 minutes of descent, lights on the drone activate and illuminate a roughly dug shaft. Initially, it is unclear what could have created the hole, but at a glance it would appear the shaft was created by a single event rather than dug over time. At 15 meters descent, there are traces of SCP-610 material attached to the dirt and stuck to rocks. The material is dormant but retains its texture and appearance. Unlike samples from above ground level, which shrivel and dry rapidly. There is a possible connection to this material and the events last recorded during SCP-610-L3. Descent continues. At 100 meters depth branch, tunnels become visible in the walls of the sinkhole. Panning of the camera reveals small tunnels branching out at apparently random intervals, but which are not restricted to any one side of the hole. These tunnels are considered too small for any useful exploration to occur. Descent continues. Increase in density of SCP-610 materials on walls is noted as depth increases. At 250 meters, the bottom of the sinkhole becomes visible and the tunnel slopes sharply, suggesting unnatural formation, which was already suspected. Drone video shifts to illuminate this tunnel, and drone proceeds forward through the area. SCP-610 coats entirety of the tunnel now, and care is taken to keep the drone from coming into contact with any surface. Movement is detected, 5 meters ahead. Lights on the drone are dimmed and weapons come online. The RSCP-610 drone is equipped with a 5.56mm machine gun containing 50 rounds of ammo. This is meant to be used to deter wildlife away from the drone and defend against aggression when possible rather than dispatch a target, although it is fully capable of handling human aggressors in small groups. Camera focus turns the moving mass of flesh ahead at 3 meters. After focus clears, the movement appears to be coming from what appears to be a deer, uninfected, wriggling in the grips of tendrils composed of SCP-610 material. The deer is being suspended above the ground with unclear intent. The drone is moved past the trapped deer while holding it in view of the camera until safely away. Nothing occurs with the deer, and the drone proceeds past undisturbed. The previously fairly level ground of the tunnel displays large humps and apparently random placement 5 meters ahead of the drone, 30 meters past the encountered deer. Upon approach, these lumps turn out to be similar to the infected villagers who escaped from Site A into the sinkhole from the destruction of Site C. The sound of rushing water is now detected and the drone is pushed forward. 100 meters further and the tunnel sound of running water is now deafening. Drone lights reveal a running stream of water, potentially from one of the adjacent rivers. In the area, a sample vial is placed in the water, allowed to collect, and then released with an active tracking beacon. Later recovery of the sample indicates no SCP-610 contamination of groundwater. The tunnel splits in two at this point. One tunnel leads around the river and then seems to slope downward, while the other is directly above a light source in the ceiling. The second one is selected to facilitate recovery of the drone. During adjustments of the drone's flight path, it comes in contact with a portion of the tunnel wall coated in SCP-610, causing a deep gash from the propeller of the drone, which is already healing over when the camera focuses on the impact point. The drone proceeds upwards. 300 meters of upwards travel, taking approximately 45 minutes, results in the drone emerging into a windy section of mountain where it is directed to stay low. Camera panning of the area reveals what may have once been a village, long since abandoned. The precise location is unclear, but is assumed to be in the vicinity of Site B, judging from estimates and travel by the drone. The buildings here are coated in deceased layers of SCP-610, and unlike other buildings in Site A and Site C, which were coated in SCP-610, these buildings appear to be constructed directly from the tissue substance. After a cursory scan of Site B, it is determined that there is no life here, either natural or SCP-610 related, so the drone is directed back into the tunnel, as the winds around the area make aerial recovery impossible. Upon descent into the tunnel, a deep roaring sound fills the audio and video feeds become choppy as something blocks the signal. During the periods in which the connection to the drone is clearest, its cameras and weapons are angled downward and propellers slow in speed to allow a faster drop. Video feed becomes entirely clear for the first 2 minutes before feed is lost. Rushing up towards the drone from the area below is what appears to be a large human face stretched to 20 times its proportion, with no features save those created by the SCP-610 material. There are eye sockets but no eyes, a mouth but no teeth. The drone fires upon this rushing mass of SCP-610, but the bullets do not deter it. Impact points remain visible for several seconds before closing over themselves. There is no room in the tunnel for the drone to take evasive action, and it is swallowed by the mass. SCP-610 is considered lost until 3 hours later when feed inexplicably returns. Video feed from the drone appears to show a series of structures, illuminated by 1 or 2 lights on the drone. The camera pans around without instructions from the remote relays or HQ, capturing a vast number of shambling entities within the area. SCP-610 material moves over the lens of the drone, and video feed is permanently severed. So in Field Log 4, we have another encounter with what I believe is intended to be the boss character in the RPG that the story is clearly setting the ground for. I do think you're getting some interesting characterization of how SCP-610 works, in that there's this giant body that seeks to incorporate all of the zombies that are being created, which I assume is what the shambling masses inside of the giant body are once it swallows the drone. But again, I think it's really starting to overstay its welcome as a singular piece of fiction. I would be really psyched to play this as a person that plays games like Call of Cthulhu, but I'm not sure how excited I am to read this as a standalone story. There are better standalone stories. I have trouble seeing much appeal for this story's 4th and 5th logs if you're not a player in the game that is intended to go along with the story. All right, final log entry, Field Log 5 for SCP-610. Approval from Central HQ was granted for a manned assault excursion into the tunnels beneath Site A to try to ascertain the extent of the SCP-610 infection. The destruction of Site A and Site C have established SCP-610 can be contained and destroyed, making the source of the infection top priority. The initial descent into the tunnels consists of 5 teams, 2 research and 3 assault, along with enough equipment to establish an underground base of operations. Descent into the tunnels was established using pulley systems and a lift to move equipment. Assault teams were the first to descend, armed with flame units to clean SCP-610 out of the area. All teams were able to descend without incident, and flame units took point, providing an undisturbed journey toward the water source where the SCP-610 drone was lost. Base camp for underground SCP-610 operations resides at the bottom of a 3-way junction. 4 if the water flow is included. The first pathway is that which led from Site A to Cavern HQ. The second is the pathway to the ruined village residing in the mountain above, where SCP-610 was destroyed by a large unknown SCP-610 entity. The third pathway heads west and seems to follow the flow of water for an unknown distance. The cavern area here is quite large and is supported by a large number of rock formations that are coated with a decayed SCP-610 material. The state of the material suggests great age and appears to reinforce the structural supports. Whether this is intentional or coincidental is unknown. The 2 research teams split activities between building Cavern HQ and collecting samples of SCP-610 in various states. No contagious materials were detected within the area, and the creature recorded by unmanned drones did not appear at any point to the cavern staff. Of the 4 research teams, 3 were ordered to proceed down the unexplored pathway, while an aerial drone was prepped for a second recon of the vertical shaft. SCP-610 infection did not appear in the third pathway until approximately 3 kilometers, and serious infection did not appear until 16 kilometers in. Even after the lengths traveled by the assault teams, no SCP-610 infectious life forms were encountered, and the fleshy material coating the cavern wall posed no threat to the team. The most significant reports at this time were the increasing thickness of material, suggesting a source and a complete lack of SCP-610 contamination in the water. As a test, a sample of SCP-610 was cut away from the cavern and placed in the flow of water. It exhibited no unusual reactions, but it was quickly swept away by the current. Seems like a bad idea. At 20 kilometers in, the leader of the assault team requested a transport buggy be dispatched to them. One was available at the above-ground HQ. However, it would take time to move it to Cavern HQ, and then remote drive it to the teams. Rations provided to the assault teams were sufficient, so a camp was established while the buggy was moved and readied. During the time, an aerial drone was also sent to explore the vertical shaft. The results of this exploration were placed on hold, and the arrival of the buggy at Cavern HQ and ultimately concluded in document data expunged. The buggy was navigated to the assault team encampment with no events en route. However, upon arrival in preparation to continue the exploration, the assault teams came upon attack by a number of large SCP-610 infected life forms that emerged from the area ahead of them. Video recovered from the assault team cameras show them caught off guard as the SCP-610 infected made no sound and were undetectable. On one film, for 1 to 2 seconds, it appears that some of the creatures are coming out of the SCP-610 materials on the wall, not emerging from them so much as being created by the material and then breaking away to act independently. During this assault, in an attempt to protect the buggy, blank members were lost to the water currents and contact with them was lost. Contact was regained, however, and it is recorded in SCP-610 Log 6. So at some point, the players were supposed to find these lost researchers. The remainder of the assault team now consisted of 3 members armed with a single flame unit. Use of this unit to repel the assault proved vital as standard firearms did minimal damage to the infected creatures. These infected creatures show minimal traits to associate them with any known life form in the region, giving rise to the belief that they may have been spawned by the SCP-610 infection itself as a form of defense. No further casualties were suffered during the raid, and the remaining members managed to eliminate all attacking infected, allowing them to continue with the exploration with added orders to attempt to locate lost team members. A further 20 kilometers into the tunnel, the river separated from the tunnel pathway, and the team was instructed to abandon the recovery order given the inability to navigate the water safely. A total of redacted time has passed before the remaining assault team reached the end of the tunnel. At the perimeter of the area now known as Site B, the team came under assault again from a smaller number of SCP-610 that were much larger in size. These infected appeared in the tunnel as if they were lying in wait for the approaching team. These creatures were dispatched using the flame unit, although all fuel for this unit was expended in the act. The assault team was now limited to standard weapons and short-range personal flame units. A time lapse of 5 minutes is allowed to pass before the team proceeds further into Site B, cautious of further assaults by SCP-610 infected. The tunnel widens out into what appears to have once been a village of indeterminate age. The construction of the buildings in this area are primitive compared to the settlements at Site A and Site C and are of clearly human construction. Many buildings rest at angles or slants, suggesting they were disturbed by a cave-in. Of interest is a building that appears to be a church with a working clock tower. So another thing that you can't really check very well because of the lack of archival information that's included in a lot of these SCP entries is when the individual logs were added. This log in particularly makes me think it came along a little bit later because it seems that the connections between Sarkicism and the Church of the Broken God are starting to kind of coalesce in this story. And if you're not super familiar with SCP Wiki lore, basically in the very early stages of Series 1, the SCP-610 story spawned a religion of the flesh that is, like I said, inspired by neo-Gnosticism, intended to be an evil religion, but it has a counterpart, which is a kind of mechanical religion, a religion that worships technology, that is also evil in different ways than Sarkicism. It's still a source for evil in the SCP Wiki. It's not like one's good and one's bad. But here, because one is called the Church of the Broken God and the other is Sarkicism, annoying, we start to have a coalescing of those two in this story. This makes me think this log came a little bit later than the other ones. Surrounding all structures in this area is a depression in the ground filled with substance resembling a liquefied form of SCP-610 fleshy materials. The pool moves as if acted upon by minute and unseen forces, rippling outward from invisible contact points and rolling in waves from unfelt winds. The team avoids the pool at all times and proceeds through the ruins slowly on stable foundations where possible, making the church their target area. Within the church are pews, as would be expected. However, there are only 4, one of them shattered, when the building could accommodate as many as 20. The 3 intact pews are arranged in a 2-1 formation facing a pulpit. There is no trace of dust on any surface, the entire area appearing to be immaculately clean, given the location and believed age. Behind the pulpit is a hole in the floor exposing an area of SCP-610 pool beneath the building. The church and ruins appear to be uninhabited. Exploration of the church proper is uneventful until the clock tower bell tolls. This tolling triggers a shudder in the building, followed by human screams from the ceiling. Lights shown upon the ceiling reveal a large mass of SCP-610, from which descend a series of 6 wooden circles. Strapped to each circle is a living human coated entirely from neck to toe in SCP-610, but having an exposed head which appears uninfected. These human captives scream as the bell continues to toll, and the circles move to the ground. The team begins to move toward one to investigate, when an unknown creature cries from outside the building, prompting them to take cover in shadows near the pulpit. Light sources are extinguished, pitching the entire area into darkness. Night vision is left off to avoid revealing the team's location. Sounds continue to emit from the outside of the church, drawing closer, but lower than the frantic screams of the captive humans. At least one noticed the team, as the captive humans often call out to be saved. From the entrance to the church, a candle lights on the side of the doorway, then one on the other side. A figure is seen holding a small torch and moving back and forth between a series of candles to light the doorway. The flame is then applied to a rope coated in SCP-610, which quickly ignites and spreads up to a peculiar chandelier system at the church entrance. The light from the system illuminates most of the crosses, but does not reach the team's hiding place. These captives who appear in the light do not show standard signs of the beige-colored SCP-610 infection, but instead are wrapped in a red variant of it, which shows signs of constant motion rippling across itself in waves. From outside the church, a flood of SCP-610 infected shamble quickly into the area, ignoring the man who lit the candles and stands in the middle of the room. They proceed to the captives on the wooden circles and begin to pull at the SCP-610 masses, resulting in further screams and cries. From what can be gathered from the returned video feed, the red SCP-610 seems to be connected to the captives and is using them as a source of sustenance that it uses to grow and feed the normal SCP-610 infected. Overly zealous infected tear at the red mass too hard, which results in pulling skin and tissue from the human captive beneath. This exposed area is quickly covered up by the red mass, which then grows in size. Feeding like this continues for approximately 6 minutes, at which time the candle-bearing figure sounds a gong and all infected entities move to the pews. There are several more creatures than seats, but none move past the frontmost pews. This scene's interesting to me because it is kind of a riff on transubstantiation, the idea that during a Catholic or Christian service, when you engage in communion, you're eating the flesh of Christ. This is like a perversion of that. And so the idea of Sarkicism or Gnosticism as a perversion of Christianity is definitely very alive in the story, even in the early stages of the SCP Wiki, though, like I said, I do suspect that this story comes a little bit later because some of the themes related to how the Wiki tends to talk about Sarkicism are much more fleshed out at this point. Pun not intended, but I'll take credit for it. The figure who sounded the gong does not move, spontaneously collapsing as if made from hollow clay. From the pulpit area, activity is noticed as a pillar of SCP-610 flesh rises from the hole and extends, directing itself toward the gathered creatures. No sound is heard, and no motion is recorded once the pillar stops moving. The silent period persists for 10 minutes without even the human captives making a sound, having fallen silent at an unknown point. The pillar of SCP-610 retracts back into the hole it emerged from without any warning, prompting the departure of the infected from the building. The candles remain lit, and the team emerges after all infected appear to leave the area. The descended captives remain at ground level as well, all screaming, seeming to have ceased, but still showing signs of life with heavy breathing and movement. Upon departure from the church, camera feeds from all 3 members have become erratic. Camera 1 ceases transmitting completely, Camera 2 shoots straight up to the air for several meters, and Camera 3 captures the member with Camera 2 being flung by a tendril that emerges out of the ground itself, swinging them out of sight onto the other side of the ruins. Camera 1's feed is restored and displays Camera 3's owner running briefly in the direction of the lost team member, only to turn and run back as SCP-610 infected pour from between buildings. Combat ensues between the 2 members and the onrushing infected using assault rifles and personal flame units, successfully driving back enough of the horde to make an escape toward the buggy. Passing by a building, Camera 1's owner is ambushed by a figure resembling the figure who was in the church lighting candles, wielding a large crop scythe. Camera 3's owner continues without pause toward the buggy location. However, the buggy is found half absorbed by the SCP-610 mask covering the floor. While turning to find another way of escape, Camera 3's owner turns to find the same figure with the scythe approaching, weapon raised. 2 shots are fired and the camera feed ends. 5 hours later, while final decisions were underway to decide how to contain or eradicate the SCP-610 threat, time-delayed video feed from the lost team members who fell into the underground river currents was established and has been filed in SCP-610-L6. So, the final log was intended to be these team members working their way out of this infected area, and we never got it because he didn't get a chance to do the RP that he had intended to be transcribed for the purpose of this 6th field log. And that becomes the end of SCP-610. My overall take on the story is it's written like a supplement used for a role-playing game. Not only do we know this is a fact based on the plans for the abandoned 6th entry in the field research log, but it also aligns perfectly with the idea that Mark Powell's art was circulating in communities that have an interest in constructing miniatures, namely people who play TTRPGs and wargames. Unfortunately, as a story, this is built almost entirely as a plot hook for an RPG. It's pretty middle of the road, though it still stands out because there's a level of concision that is required in writing RPG plot hooks that some of the other writers in the early days of the SCP Wiki were not as well versed in. They were not well versed in making their stories short and to the point. I think that this story is not any weaker than SCP-93, but it is about half as long. And so I think that's an important thing that makes it a little bit of a stronger entry in the writing. Also, despite the effort that I've put into deriding lit RPGs in this video, I don't think that it's necessarily a guaranteed conclusion that a story that is written like an RPG or based off of an RPG has to have the little characterization and focus on minutia like supplies that the characters in the story are bringing with them that kind of bogs SCP-610 down. There's actually at least one example specifically that tries to be an RPG that is about creepypastas. In public access, you play a group of people who meet online but have gathered for a summer to investigate the disappearance of a TV station that disappeared when you were all children. You can set the exact date of this at different times depending on the time period of the game that you're running, but by default, the game casts you as kind of Gen X millennial cuspers who are in their 20s in 2004 when the game takes place. The time period allows for the game to use a mix of the kind of analog horror aspects that have recently become popular. In game, you're going to investigate an eldritch mystery by looking for the mysterious VHS tapes that were associated with this TV station, while still rooting the game in a lot of the 90s nostalgia that shows up in a lot of popular creepypastas. From Sonic to SpongeBob, fodder of the 90s has been a frequent source of creepypastas and fit in perfectly in this time period. The 90s aesthetic the game roots itself in ends up coming up quite a bit in the overall gameplay because your characters will have to reminisce about their childhood to recover sanity, which means that oftentimes characters are referencing some of their favorite games, shows, and toys from when they were kids. If you haven't played it yet, I think it's a blast, and if you're watching my channel and have made it this far in the video, chances are you would absolutely love it if you got a chance to play it. The reason that I point out this RPG in particular is that I don't think it's necessarily a mistake to use the writing that you have to do in playing an RPG as a stepping stone to writing great short stories. But this specific instance is lacking something that most great RPG hooks have, which is characterization. If you go and look at a sample adventure in public access, it offers characterization for the NPCs that you're going to draw from in the adventure that includes everything from backstories to how a character dresses, and even sometimes when relevant, what a character smells like. My biggest problem with SCP-610 isn't that it's a DM's attempt to serve as a plot hook for a story, but it's that there's next to no characterization given to anyone or anything in the story. We do get some brief attempts at characterizing the zombies and how they continue with some of the same rituals that they may have done when alive, albeit in a more horrifying and eldritch fashion, but the only living characters that we're introduced to, like the D-Class or the researchers that go into the tunnels, are kept around for such little time and given no dialogue that there isn't ever an opportunity to either envision or tell a story beyond the initial RPG hook. I think that this story shows one of the other problems in the early days of the SCP Wiki, and it's not that people were allowed to create these ekphrastic stories that later then had to be edited or altered away from the image of the artist, but it's that a lot of the people that were writing these stories were more interested in finding a horror-based internet community away from the X board than they were in crafting these strong short stories. The shift toward the wiki trying to tell interesting short stories over the course of the investigation log was solved over time, but it was a slow and gradual improvement and not one that happened overnight. One interesting detail that I've already noted is that there are almost no problems in common between SCP-93 and SCP-610, and the people who read both and then tried to incorporate the positives of both stories into their own designs were able to tell good stories in the end. However, one of my earliest memories of an SCP that was a fully fleshed out standalone story that made me fall in love with the idea of the SCP Wiki didn't really come along until nearly a half decade later in SCP-2264, which details the SCP universe's own version of the Dread City Carcosa, called Algata in Universe, and one that I'm planning to cover after finishing the weird fiction stories within The King in Yellow. I mentioned enjoying a lot of the overall lore of the SCP Wiki, even though I'm someone that's kind of derided the idea as lore being a necessary piece of art, and I feel like I kind of want to explain what I mean exactly by that. The lore in the SCP Wiki, especially in something like this that kind of plants the seeds of what Sarcasm is going to become in the Wiki. Anyway, that's it for me for this one, folks. Stay golden out there.